listening to the Virtual CISO podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO podcast. With you as always, John Verry, your host, and with me today, Mike Craig. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how's it going?
It is going shaky. I'm in an office which is being deconstructed around me. We closed our office and moved into another place, so hopefully it won't be too noisy in the background here. So I always like to start simple. Tell me a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do every day?
Sure. So I partner with Pivot Point Security with my own company called Vanaheim Security. And what I do every day is I help commercial companies who are making the decision or going through the process of achieving FedRAMP authorization with the federal government to achieve that authorization in all of its intricacies and nuances all the way through the process.
Which is exactly why you're here today. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you about that. Before we get down to that, I always ask, what's your drink of choice?
So I am a straight bourbon kind of guy.
Love it. Give me. What's your go-to?
So Jameson on the rocks is the go-to for just the regular old Friday night. Occasionally we get in some sort of Kentucky bourbon. My family's from that area, so we have. Have you done
the Bourbon Trail? If your family's from the area.
I have, but it's been a long time since I was living in that area. I was military, so I moved around all over the place and haven't actually been home in quite some time.
Yeah, it's one of the, I'm a huge bourbon guy myself, and it's actually one of the shocking things is I have not done the Bourbon Trail yet, so got to get my butt there. Butt there. All right, so let's talk about FedRAMP. So getting a FedRAMP ATO, or authorization to operate, is essentially necessary if you want to be a cloud services provider to a federal agency, or at least a significant one. There's definitely a pot of gold at the end of the road, but the path to get there is definitively a long and a bit arduous one. So excited to talk about how do we optimize that journey. So let's start with the basics. What is FedRAMP, and who should consider it?
So the FedRAMP program as a whole it was formed in 2017 because each individual agency going through the ATO, or authorization to operate process, was individually accrediting these service providers that were providing cloud services to multiple agencies. So three of the big names came together. That's GSA, DoD, and DHS. Came together to provide a sort of joint trust organization that can authorize these cloud services and then inherit the controls for each individual agency that has to go through this Federal Information Systems Management Act, FISMA, process within their agencies. So when you're providing a service on a federal contract, you can leverage these cloud services to help you meet security controls, for example, or data hosting inside of a data center, where you can use those services legally within your own ATO as a partner, or if you're the service provider yourself, able to provide those services to multiple agencies with only one authorization.
Gotcha. So just to be clear, what we're saying is that if I'm a SaaS and I want to gain a FedRAMP authorization to operate to sell to one or more agencies, that if I'm using, let's say, Azure, or if I'm using AWS, that I'm able to inherit the controls that they've already implemented, which is roughly what, 19-20% or something of that nature?
For the physical data center hosting, yeah.
Yep. Okay. Cool. So I know that when we chat about FedRAMP, I know you like to break it up into sort of, I'll loosely call them three buckets: pathfinding, architecture, and assessment prep. And I know you have fancier titles than that, but I simplified things. I'll let you come up with the fancier titles here. So let's kind of walk through that. So what do you mean by pathfinding, and what does that phase typically encompass?
Sure. So when I'm working with a client and we're just starting off in that journey, there are a couple different things that you need to even get started in the process down the FedRAMP road. You need to have a sponsor agency, which means you have to be selling directly to the government already before you get this authorization, and they have to be willing to sponsor you into the collective whole. So you have to find a sponsor, and you have to have that relationship built up. The other part is that it needs to make business sense. While you could be just going after this one particular agency, and that's really kind of the main niche for your SaaS service, you really want to look at your market strategy as a whole within the federal government, serving multiple agencies, and exactly how many you're looking to sell to, and you think you have a market for it, because there are different types of accreditations. So choosing the right accreditation path for your business, it makes the most sense. And then there's the cost and capital outlays. As you mentioned before, this is a very long process. It can take a year or more from beginning to end. And so making sure that you have that executive buy-in and the capital laid out, ready to go through this process, because it's going to take a long tail. There's a long tail before you start seeing that revenue return. So we start off that process deciding the best path forward.
Okay. So pathfinding is ostensibly ensuring that we have a well business rationalized plan to go forward on, right? And this does indeed make sense.
Yep. And the steps to begin the process, finding that sponsorship, engagement, and those components.
Right. Now you mentioned that there are multiple, I forget the word you used, but basically multiple levels, if you will, right, that you might choose. Talk a little bit about that, right? We've got low, moderate, high, and we've got, what is it, LISAS?
LISAS is an option. It's definitely the least common one. But LISAS is a very, very light authorization for SaaS providers that are going to be integrated with others inside of a government solution and not have access to any sensitive data that the government considers sensitive. So it is an option, but not a very common one. Above that, you have low, and by far the most common is moderate. Moderate is where you are able to hold government data and sensitive data at that first authorization level. At FedRAMP High is an even higher level of authorization and more sensitive data, and that's going to depend on the agency as to which level they're going to ask for in their contracts. It's really their risk decision.
Gotcha. So in terms of when we're working through that pathfinding, specifically, and that's where I guess the value prop is of knowing not only who are they talking to right now, but who they might be talking to. Because like I've had to talk to people that are looking at a low authorization, and my general recommendation if someone's looking low is bite the bullet, spend a little bit more, go moderate, because that's sort of the sweet spot of the market, right?
Right. And like you were saying, in those different authorization levels too, I mean, if you have aspirations of selling to DoD and holding like sensitive DoD data, you're going to have to go into FedRAMP High at some point, and so does it make the most sense to try and meet the control requirements of FedRAMP High at the beginning, while shooting for sponsorship for a FedRAMP Moderate, and then making that jump later after you've made those architecture investments, and it's all a capital outlay decision, right? And how long that'll take, and how many changes you would need to make. So all of that stuff is what we talk about in that pathfinding phase to make sure that your engagement strategy for your sponsor makes sense, that your market plan and aspirations are commensurate with the level that you're shooting for, and then that pathway to get to that end goal. It may make sense to make multiple steps or a single leap all the way up to high. And so that's where we lay all of those different options out and cost benefit of each one.
Gotcha. All right, so that pathfinding phase is over, and we typically move into what you refer to commonly as architecture and assessment prep. Talk a little bit about what happens in that phase.
So depending on where you're coming from as a company, right? So my clients that are coming in from a purely commercial sector with no federal experience at all usually have a commercial SaaS available option, but there are architecture requirements within the FedRAMP controls that you can try to say, I use the air quotes here, federalize your commercial application. But more commonly, what ends up happening is building a second, smaller federal enclave just to meet those control requirements. Sometimes if your sponsoring agency can add in some additional requirements as well. And so you may have, say, offshore teams that are providing your tech support, where they may have to be, your federal team may have to be located within the US. And there are a bunch of other requirements that sort of come with it. So depending on where you're coming from, you may have small or large architectural process and HR changes that would need to come with achieving that FedRAMP authorization. And so that enterprise architecture approach of your people, process, technology, all the way through end to end for operating your SaaS platform for federal clients, we look at what would actually need to change, how would you get there, how do you need to architect it in order to meet these requirements. And so we can start you down that path while you're concurrently working your sponsor engagement strategy.
Yeah, the challenge of trying to run, let's say, an ISO 27001 certified system and a FedRAMP ATO system in the same bucket is that you have to build to the high watermark.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the effectiveness and efficiency of operation. I mean, you could do that, but you're going to be spending a lot more to support an ISO client or a commercial client that really doesn't care about attestation than would be necessary.
Right. And that becomes sort of your market segmentation analysis that we do in that first phase, right? Of just what does the profitability look like on your global enterprise, and does this make sense to make a whole separate system or not?
Gotcha. And what else? Anything else get covered in that assessment prep? I mean, where are we? Is that where we're beginning to, like as an example, I'd say arguably the single most important document in a FedRAMP ATO is the system security plan. Where how much of the system security plan are we looking at there in that particular phase?
So I'm talking about three separate phases. You have your pathfinding, where you're doing your business evaluation, then your architecture and decision making around your enterprise architecture of technical and process, and then the assessment prep.
Okay,
which
so
comes
you consider that. Yeah. So where the rubber's starting to hit the road is all in that assessment prep phase.
Right. Because you're going to write this massive document, the system security plan, like you just mentioned. The average is like 500 to 600 pages. It's very templatized, but there is a lot of detail that goes into this document. If you already have those processes and architecture built, and you know exactly what you're doing, built to the controls, then the documentation goes much faster, and there's not a lot of back and forth, not a lot of changes, speeds up the process tremendously. So in that assessment prep, you have your documentation, which is the system security plan and approximately 25 other attachments and documents that go with that entire package for the ATO, that authorization to operate submission that we're going to give to the sponsor. But at the end of this whole process, before the authorization, you're going to be assessed by a third-party assessment organization, the 3PAO. They're going to come into your environment. They're going to perform a penetration test. They're going to look through your documentation, and then they're going to start testing according to various explicit requirements around to ensure that they have documentation and proof that you are meeting those controls in your environment, both process and technology. So that assessment preparation phase is really to prepare you for that moment. It's a large, expensive cost, and you want to do well on it because you've spent a significant amount of time and resources to get up to this point. That assessment prep has its own sort of function too, where the team who may or may not be familiar with the FedRAMP process, with these controls, or how to speak to them, what the assessors are looking for. There's just a lot of ambiguity that sort of goes into it when you're learning this the first time. And so that assessment prep process goes into the organizational learning. I call it building that muscle memory around understanding what evidence they're looking for and how they're going to interview you, how that process is going to go, and help preparing all of your teams and speakers, identifying who that's going to be, and sort of organizing this large interview process that comes with these assessments.
So you touched on it a little bit with the idea that you've got this 3PAO that you're working back and forth with. Can you talk about, I look at FedRAMP as being sort of a choreographed dance, between the ISO, or, whether it's the JAB or it's an agency ATO, the 3PAO and you, and there's a lot of back and forth. And can you talk a little bit about that choreography just to kind of set expectation for folks?
Sure. So the process as a whole, you're going to decide that this going toward a FedRAMP authorization makes business sense for you. You're going to find a sponsor, and there's a whole engagement process that comes with that. But after you find the sponsor, you're going to very quickly want to find a third-party assessment organization, a 3PAO. Now, the organization that does your advising cannot also be the one doing the testing. It's written into the rules. So you have to find a different one if you're partnering with someone or a firm as your advisor. Find that 3PAO because they're going to be able to help answer some of the more ambiguous questions, and they can go together with your sponsoring agency, and you can have a three-way conversation to sort of figure out some of these ambiguous controls, how the sponsor would prefer to handle it because they're the ones who are ultimately going to sign off on your authorization package. And you can get that clarification very early in the process, and I highly recommend doing that. As you go through that assessment preparation, so the solution building, documentation, assessment preparation, that dance, choreography for the big show of the assessment itself, that's when the 3PAO is actually going to come in and perform that function where they are beholden to the agency sponsor, right? And they work for them at that point and are collecting this data to prove that you are doing what you say you're doing in your submission package.
Yeah, and how much does that, can you give folks a little bit idea how much that might differ, and what are the pros and cons of a JAB-centric approach versus an agency ATO approach?
Sure. So another player in this, regardless of whether you're going an agency or a JAB authorization, is the FedRAMP Program Management Office. They're going to be the central belly button, if you will, that your application is going to go through. And they are also going to be working with your agency sponsor behind the scenes, or the JAB. Now, the JAB stands for the Joint Authorization Board. That is those three founding member agencies that I talked about, GSA, DOD, DHS. They have contracted teams out who are reviewers who do nothing but this and manage JAB authorizations. The pros and cons of each one, agency sponsorship is far and away the most common. And you have that foot in the door to a government agency that you are probably already selling your services to, or that has agreed to sponsor you in this process because they need your services. You already have that relationship. It's the simplest way to get in. The JAB authorization is taken from a collective pool of applicants in a given year, and they only take a very select number of candidates in a given year based on their perceived ability to get through those applications and take on new systems inside of JAB's management. It's much longer, it's much harder. The controls are more exacting. Those gray areas and interpretation that I was mentioning earlier, they have a much stricter stance than most agencies. But at the same time, as an agency sponsor, if you go that route, it's simpler, faster. But if you ever lose that client and you are selling to multiple, you expand your services and you are now selling to multiple government clients. If you lose that sponsor agency as a client, then you lose your FedRAMP authorization with it, and you have to go through the process all over again. If you have contractual obligations for you to be FedRAMP authorized, there will be a period where you would not be without covering that in some other way through a secondary system or something else. There are options, but they're all difficult. Now, conversely, on the side of the JAB, you have this extremely long tail to get in. I didn't mention this in my intro, but I have been a 3PAO assessor, but I've also had P&L leadership responsibility on a multi-cloud FedRAMP platform that walked the whole process through from FedRAMP moderate at the JAB authorization all the way up to FedRAMP high and DoD impact levels. It was a 4 is where we got to with an application for 5. So I've been through both where your listeners are. I've been an assessor, and I've been on the advising side, kind of gone through every function of this. The regulators as well. I worked with them when I worked at DHS's agency-wide assessment organization. So I've been around, done this, know most of the people. That JAB sponsorship for me on my platform took 18 months from application to actually accepting us for our application to then start going through multiple assessment processes. End to end, it took 2.5 years to get that JAB authorization. But the magic number was 6. 6 separate government agencies that wanted our services. So once we sort of hit that multi-agency demand, they took us on, and then it took a very long time. But when it did happen, as so long as we were able to keep 6 ATOs that were leveraging our authorization, then we were able to maintain our authorization without any individual sponsor or client. So that's the trade-off. Much longer, much more expensive, more difficult, but as a large multi-agency service provider, we weren't beholden to any individual client as our sponsor. If we lost any individual one, we didn't lose our whole authorization.
So we talked earlier about how critical that pathfinding phase is, right? Getting this thing off on the right foot, right? Minimize cost, reducing complexity, shortening time to target ideally. You've been doing this a bit. What are some, I'll call it tips or tricks or lessons learned from previous engagements?
Sure. So what happens a lot is, the senior leadership team decides, like, we're going to start selling into the federal market, and so your action officers, your PMs, your team, sort of get this task from on high to go get a FedRAMP authorization without really a lot of planning that goes into it, and so it understanding that executive buy-in of what it takes to get here and having that alignment organizationally, all the way down from the beginning, is a critical step to stopping this back and forth of realizing how much money this costs. We back off, continue going, and it creates this sort of start and stop relationship with your sponsor, and it creates a lot of messes that I've seen, right? So having that organizational alignment from the beginning, whether you do it through an advisory or not, is a critical step forward. Once you start into actually picking the solution itself, another piece is that FedRAMP will authorize services inside of the major cloud providers. Not all of them, but many of them. You can find them on their individual websites, Azure, Amazon, Google Cloud. And those cloud native services allow you to speed up your federal platform build quite a bit if you're starting from scratch. If you're trying to federalize an existing program, then you want to make sure that your cloud native services that you're utilizing are FedRAMP authorized. So again, those are, you'll find in the FedRAMP marketplace has the Amazon and Azure, federal government cloud region authorizations. But if you go to the Azure website, Azure for Government website, and you go to the Amazon Web Services government website, you can find the native services that they offer that are FedRAMP authorized. Utilizing those in your build speeds things up quite a bit. And the other piece that the FedRAMP PMO really is harping on this year in particular is FIPS. So it's the Federal Information Processing Standard. It's the encryption algorithms and standards that you use for data in transit and at rest. There are specific FIPS authorizations. A lot of vendors will tell you that they are FIPS compliant. That doesn't mean that they're FIPS authorized. There's a number that comes on the website if you go look it up. And it provides the FIPS authorization number. Labeling those services inside of your data flow diagrams and everything else in your submission package is now required. So understanding that that is going to be a requirement or kind of an unspoken, unwritten requirement at the end of this whole process, very early on when you're going through your build, also saves an enormous amount of time. Vendors that you're using have to have a FIPS authorization number in their crypto modules that they're using.
Yeah, and that can get really tricky. Like, because I've seen, like,
Sure can.
like you can see versions of Linux where a lower version and an upper version both are authorized, right? But the one in the middle isn't,
Yep.
Which is just kind of odd. But I guess it's because they have to submit it for testing.
Yep. Yeah. There's a whole testing process. I've actually been through it with a client one time. It's arduous, just as much as the FedRAMP process is itself to get that FIPS authorization number.
Right. Yeah, we had a client had to roll back the version of Linux that they were using in order to be compliant.
Yep.
Which is weird, and it caused other problems.
Yeah, the throughput of the organization that performs that testing is just as limited as FedRAMP itself, and so the modules that they're using are not necessarily the latest or the strongest that are out there on the market. It's just what they were able to review in the throughput that they have. So it creates some limitations, and kind of another reason that a lot of companies end up making a separate federal environment. Because the high watermark may not even be
actually
the latest and greatest. Right. Yeah,
it might be low tide. So right. you touched on schedule timeline before, right? The idea that your certification beginning to end took 2 years. Typically we hear numbers like 1 to 2 years. Would you agree that's generally a good timeline for people to think about?
Generally so, yeah.
Okay.
So you have that sort of sponsor engagement process And inside of federal contracting, if your organization has experience with it, it takes quite a while. So you have that kind of an engagement process and your initial foot in the door contract into the federal environment and marketplace in the first place, and whether you have to go through that or you're already there, right? And then you have roughly 1 year just for the authorization process itself. That's the application. If your agency is going to require you to go through call it a pre-assessment, it's a readiness assessment with a readiness assessment report.
The RAR.
The RAR. If you have one of those, not every agency requires it, but many do in the authorization process. So that's 2 testing regimens that you have to go through. Each one takes roughly 2 months at a minimum. And depending on how complex and complicated your environment is, you may have longer testing periods. And then you have the actual package review time, which if you're submitting to the JAB or through to the PMO can also sometimes take 1 to 2 months by itself. Add all that together, you have 1 year is pretty quick. 2 years in between there is sort of more of an average time frame. But if you have a longer lead time in your architecture and that solution building process that we were talking about, because you already have a lot of robust automation in your commercial offering that you want to replicate in the federal environment, finding all of the right pieces that make your infrastructure compliant through that advising phase, that can sometimes take a long time by itself. I'm working with a client now who's on month 11 of that process because they have a large international presence, and we're having to, hire teams, build into a U.S. based data center, and then we're having to go through taking they have this extremely fast CI/CD pipeline 2-3 times a day. And we're having to figure out, how do we go through the FedRAMP compliant processes to push that kind of deployment that they're used to in a compliant way. So we found this very large, architecture to make it through, but it's taking a long time with a lot of distributed global teams to find the process that where that delineation of roles and responsibilities is going to start and stop. So that can take very long just in and of itself.
So one of the things you touched on, that RAR, right? Whether it's required or not can change pricing quite a bit, right? It's because a RAR is 50,000-ish, I guess would be a fair number to float.
Yep.
If somebody just generically said to you, hey, we're thinking about going FedRAMP moderate because that's the most common one. We're going to deploy in AWS or Azure, so we know that a lot of the physical security controls are being taken care of. Would you care to guess, what would be just a ballpark range of estimates you would tell people to set an expectation for?
I set an expectation of somewhere in between 500,000 and 1.5 million in your capital outlay across the whole process. Now that includes reserves. It includes both the RAR, the readiness assessment, and your full assessment. Now, one of the things to note is that the first assessment that you go through is the most expensive,
right?
Because you have to go through and test every single control. After that, you only test 1/3 of the controls every year. So the 3 PAOs generally charge by that scope of work. So your first one is your most expensive. So you're going to have to eat all of those costs along the way, and there is almost always at least some amount of architecture work required and PMing work required in order to make your offering compliant, even if you're already coming with federal experience selling to federal customers on an individualized basis. There's still some architecture changes required. So all in all, 500 to 1.5 million in a total end-to-end cost.
Yep. Yeah. The 1.5 is kind of more at the extreme end. I mean, but the $500,000 number for sure. I mean, because right, I mean, just at a moderate level, a typical 3PAO assessment is 2.25, 250, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean that eats up half it. The RAR is another 50. Then you've got all the build out. You've got internal cost. If you're working with a consulting firm, that can cost $100, $150, $200,000. So the numbers do add up fast. So there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but it's going to cost a lot of money and time to get there.
Right. The larger and more diversified your company is when you start, the more expensive it tends to be because the slices of people performing those roles gets narrower and narrower in larger companies, and it requires
more touch points, right?
Right, more touch points, more time, more coordination. So it's that's where the 1.5 million comes from. Really depends on how big you are when you start.
Gotcha. We beat this up pretty good. We miss anything?
Not that I can think of.
I get a gold star today. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So give me a fictional character or real world person you think would make an amazing or horrible CISO and why.
Oh man.
Uh-oh. You were doing so good. You didn't prep for this. You didn't see this question at the end of the agenda?
I didn't.
We're gonna see. We're gonna see if Mike thinks fast on his feet, folks. We're gonna see that.
I think Darkwing Duck would make a pretty great CISO. Darkwing Duck, cartoon character from the 90s.
Wow, I don't know that one.
Let's Get Dangerous. That guy? No.
Wow, I don't know that one.
Okay.
All right, so tell me why.
So that's a Disney from like the 90s, roughly. He's an investigator. He doesn't have any particularly special powers. Think of him as like a reincarnation of the Shadow Nose from the old like radio show from the 30s. Remember that?
No.
Okay. So, all right.
And if I did, I wouldn't admit to it.
I'm familiar with pop culture way outside of my time. It's really ridiculous.
You certainly don't look old enough to know something from the 1930s. That's for sure. You think about 1930s. You'd have to be like 80-something years old to know that. I
listened to it on cassette tape
really?
in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. Yep.
Wow. You should have gone 8-track.
I just missed the 8-tracks.
Okay.
That's how old I am. Yeah. Anyway, so we're talking about the 90s sort of explosion of cartoon shows after He-Man. But before the Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. So Saturday morning cartoons, Darkwing Duck. Let's Get Dangerous, that was his thing. He's an investigator by trade. But he doesn't have any particularly special powers, and he really went at his opponents in a very smart way with a it was a good use of his resources. He didn't have the Batman belt. He didn't have all that stuff. He just kind of used his mind and a limited set of tools to accomplish great things, save the world every episode.
Sounds good. Sounds a little MacGyverish to me.
A little bit.
All right. So if folks want to get in touch with you, what's the easiest way to do that?
So Mike.Craig at VanaheimSecurity.com.
Awesome. This has been fun, sir. Thank you. Appreciate you bringing the knowledge.
Thanks for having me on. It was a great talk.
All right, man.